This discussion is sponsored in part by the CLSC class of 1992. This class has contributed its white gifts to supporting authors' visits to Chautauqua since 2013. So please join me in thanking the 1992 class for their continued support of CLSC authors. The Chautauqua Literary and Scientific Circle was founded in 1878 to promote lifelong education and reading. Each class has designed a banner, and I have chosen the banner this week to be the class from 1943. And Ron, if you can just kind of hold it so people can see it. It is made of felt, which is about the only material that was available during the war years. And I chose it because I think it has a synchronicity with the week's book selection, and I think it was extremely prescient. For the Sellout, the banner reads, Builders for Tomorrow, Peace with Justice. I also thought about the class of 1992. Their theme, Discovering New Worlds, is also, I think, appropriate for this book. But I thought, let's go with 1943. This one probably hasn't been out in a while. So for today's CLSC presentation, we've asked Ron Charles, editor of the Washington Post Book World, to interview Paul Beatty. Ron Charles is the editor, the book editor for the Washington Post, and he enjoyed teaching American literature and critical theory for 12 years in the Midwest before becoming a journalist. His wife, Dawn, who is here with us, is an English teacher, and she is the cinematographer of their satirical YouTube series, The Totally Hip Video Book Review. Mr. Charles has served on the selection committee for the Pulitzer Prize, Fiction Prize, and is active in the National Book Critics Circle. Published in 2015, The Sellout is a biting send-up of American race relations, chronicling a narrator's questionable actions of reinstating slavery and segregating the local school. Hilarious and thought-provoking, The Sellout takes issues of race head-on, unconcerned about offending readers and challenging several assumed notions about American society. The first American to win the Man Booker Prize for fiction, Paul Beatty is among the funniest and most fearless writers of his time. My daughter's been reading the book this week. She has been giggling, which has kept us up late at night. And she just read the part about Kinshasa, where she lived for a time. And again, I think giggled and disturbed some people in the audience. Mr. Beatty's the author of 4 novels and 2 books of poetry. Currently lives in New York City, where he teaches creative writing at Columbia University, and we're excited to hear from him this afternoon. So, ladies and gentlemen, Ron Charles's relatives, in-laws, and outlaws, Paul Beatty's caustic critics and reasonable readers, and outrageous ranters. Please join me in welcoming Ron Charles and Paul Beatty to Chautauqua.
Thank you very much, Shara. Excuse me. Paul, I have been a reader and admirer of you for years, and I so appreciate you coming out here to speak with us today. The trouble with a novel like The Sellout, though, is that it makes so much contemporary fiction look tame and pleasant and unambitious. The Sellout is absurd enough and funny enough and outrageous enough and tragic enough and painful enough and bitter enough and smart enough to capture the whole mad function of racism in America today. It's just a brilliant book. Yesterday I heard Reverend Ginger Gaines Cirilli preach on this provocative line from the Gospels where Jesus asks, "Do you think I came to bring peace?" We might ask ourselves the same thing about great fiction. Do you think it comes to bring peace? To make you comfortable? No. Winning the Booker Prize was a great event for America, a great event for you, and it got you interviewed everywhere, and it got your book described everywhere, and again, I would see interviewers describe the book to you, and then you would say something like, no, it's not really about that. What is the Sellout about? Why is it so hard for us to describe it?
Yeah, I can't do it either. So I don't even really try, to be honest. I always find it really just numbing when people tell me what their movie's about or what their book is about. I like trying to figure it out for myself.
Yes.
But I've been doing a lot of traveling, and one thing that's been interesting for me is people coming up to me from all over the place, all different types, and telling me what the book is about.
Yes.
And it's really amazing. And it's not like they get it, but it's that the fact they got something, that they've really been touched. And the thing I've been thinking about a lot is not about writing so much, but about the way we read.
Yes.
And so for me, it's like those folks who don't necessarily come up and go, I put on my black book glasses today and I read your book. They just read the book.
Yes.
And that's been really, I don't know, I've been, for this phrase, advancing the discourse, I've just been seeing it the past few days.
You like doing that?
I don't know what that means, to be honest. And so again, like when people would ask me, what's the book about? And I was like, yeah, I don't know if I'm trying to advance the discourse. I'm just trying not to have that same discussion
That we've had before.
on and on and on and on, And so that's what I was trying to do, I guess.
Yeah. Would you read the opening paragraph for us?
Sure. This may be hard to believe coming from a black man, but I've never stolen anything. Never cheated on my taxes or at cards, never snuck into the movies or failed to give back the extra change to a drugstore cashier, indifferent to the ways of mercantilism and minimum wage expectations. I've never burgled a house, held up a liquor store, never boarded a crowded bus or subway car, sat in a seat reserved for the elderly, pulled out my gigantic penis and masturbated to satisfaction with a perverted yet somehow crestfallen look on my face. But here I am in the cavernous chambers of the Supreme Court of the United States of America, my car illegally and somewhat ironically parked on Constitution Avenue, my hands cuffed and crossed behind my back, my right to remain silent long since waived and said goodbye to, as I sit in a thickly padded chair that, much like this country, isn't quite as comfortable as it looks.
Who is this narrator whose first name we never get?
That's a really good question.
And you'd name him, his last name is Me, which is kind of tempting for those of us who want to read you as the narrator.
Yeah, I mean, it's, well, his father's name is F.K. Me. So, that's basically my name, I think, but it's, I find myself saying that all the time. But he's I mean, I guess I can talk about the name a little bit, maybe. I haven't talked about this much, but it's actually one of my favorite passages in the book, where he talks about the truncation of one letter from the name. But it started because I got this notion while I was trying to figure out that opening prologue about the case being called Me versus the United States of America.
Yes.
So then I had to recreate the history to justify that name,
Yes.
And so, and I think in some ways that's who that character is he's just always trying to recreate himself, recreate this neighborhood. None of it's real, like everyone says, oh, the book's about slavery and segregation, but he never does any of that, and so part of it is that the illusionary nature of the language, of, not that race is necessarily illusionary, but it sometimes can feel like, or we want it to be, or it is, and it, like this thing. A friend of mine just wrote some little thing about the book, and he was like, oh, this book for him is about that blackness is illusory, I don't necessarily agree with that, but but that discussion is a part of the book, and the book is not like, I think one of the things that I struggle with a little bit is, like what it's about. And so, I've had a number of these conversations. And I think a lot of people want their literature that they like to be a manifesto.
Yes.
And that is definitely not what it is. It can be for that person, I'm not going to tell. And I think for me is I struggle with the authors who go, yeah, it is a manifesto.
What I really wanted to say was this, but I disguised it as a novel.
Yeah. And so, I'm just rambling. I'm sorry.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Not at all. It's not something else. It is the novel itself.
Yeah. It's, I have a hard time talking. Maybe not today, but usually. But, the whole satire thing would come up, and I'd come up with my little rationalizations of why I don't, why that word makes me uncomfortable.
It's often described as a satire, and you have pushed back against that characterization.
Yeah, a woman in the audience said, she goes, "This isn't satire because it's real life." And I was like, all right. I was like, yeah, I need to bring you, and just, but I have these other issues about it. But it brought me back to an old clip of Nabokov talking about Lolita on television. And he's with Lionel Trilling. And the TV commentator talks about that book, the book's just come out, and how that book is a satire. And I went, man, I would never think about that book as a satire. Because for me, that phrase is so limiting. And then so they're having this discussion, and Trilling does something that I rarely hear people do, is he acknowledges that anything that Nabokov is going to say is going to be utter bullshit, because that's his job. You know what I mean? It's just, he acknowledges like this notion of reading fiction as truth, like this insistence of authenticity and all this kind of stuff. And you don't get anything out of Nabokov because he's like, yeah, I got nothing to say in a weird way, because everybody is that you? Is this? And he's, he's got his little witty answers. And, yeah, I'm going to be quiet, sorry.
And the narrator's father puts him through a very unusual and bizarre program of education, homeschooling.
Yeah.
Describe that for us.
Yeah,
It's often brutal.
Yeah, he does these psych experiments on him, these classic social psychology experiments on his son. And it comes out of the notion, I was getting my doctorate in psychology, and then kind of just left to start writing. And I don't know how to start talking about this really, but I have a friend, her dad's a black psychologist. Mm-hmm. And there's some references in the book to a paper written by a guy named Dr. William Cross, who wrote this, how is the formation of black identity, how is that? He's got these stages. And I remember reading that and being really impressed by it. I didn't agree with much of it, but it was so meticulous, so thoughtful.
These are the stages we see at the very last pages of the novel?
I kind of messed, you know me, it's all BS, of course. So it's but that was really important to me because I realized that while he's saying you're this at this point, you're this at that point, and I was like, no, you're all these things at the same time sometimes. It's like the way we talk about identity is kind of weird. Anyways, so my friend, whose father was a psychologist, was the only person who I've known in life who actually knew of this thing. So we were talking about it. And we talked about this notion of how he raised her. And it's like, it's almost like you're trying to create these kind of perfect Frankensteinian monsters, which so much, it's not just African-American words or anything, because you're trying to protect this shell. You're trying to, And so this character has his own idea of how to do that. And, it affects that son because he's kind of been programmed to do this stuff. He's talked about operant conditioning and stuff in the book. And he's aware of that and he's trying to break out of it. But there's some footsteps that his father has laid that, he can't get out of.
And a lot of it's brutal.
Yeah, it's brutal because they're talking about brutal things.
He's preparing him for a brutal world.
Yeah. And it's the idea of, one of the things, I remember one of the first things I learned in psychology was, when you see these really graphic anti-smoking ads,
Yes.
With
People's
calcified lungs and all this kind of stuff. He goes, I don't know if it's still true, but the the notion then was those have the opposite effect, like those don't work.
Really?
They kind of drive you to smoke, because you're like, okay, I don't know, the logic behind it. But that was always really interesting to me, and his father is kind of, I don't know what his father's reasoning for this is, it's, some of it's just mean, his father's kind of a mean person. But I think he thinks he's inculcating his son against, Los Angeles, I guess.
And when the city of Dickens is rubbed off the map, the narrator, me, is really upset about that. And that's, if the book has a plot, it's trying to get that city back on the map.
Yeah.
And the way he goes about that is absurd. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the book's absurd from start to finish.
Yeah.
In the way that life is absurd, I hope. My wife says something. She says, the unimaginable happens all the time.
Yes.
And,
in your book or in life?
I think she means in life.
Oh, okay.
I think it's bigger than the book. But that really rings, that strikes a chord with me. So I don't think in these absurdist, magical realism kind of things. I'm just trying to tell the story the way that I do. You asked me a question, I've forgotten.
It's just that it lands him in the Supreme Court, where he's accused of segregation and slavery, but he thinks his real crime is whispering racism in a post-racial world.
Yeah, he does. I don't even, I'm terrible at talking about this.
Not
I'm
at
so
all.
sorry.
Not at all.
But, you have to come up with these little trite things to talk about the book, because you're on television for 40 seconds. So my thing was, that phrase, fight fire with fire?
Yes.
This character kind of chooses to fight racism with racism.
Yes.
The sense that we've tried everything else, let's do this thing. But it also comes from, these threads of thought that, I've heard forever. African Americans were better off under segregation.
You've heard that?
Yeah, of course. I think.
From who?
You read
like
it.
Klansmen? who says that?
That's a good question. I don't know if I've ever heard a white person say that.
Now wait, you've heard black people say black people were better.
Are there any black people here who can justify? Thank you. It's. So you heard this, and I had been thinking about this. It's this sense of, it's this notion of independence, this notion of doing for self. It's a long litany of stuff, and you still hear it. And I have a friend, actually my wife's brother, who teaches at Princeton now, and was like looking at all this kind of stuff, and I was like, is this in the literature? And he's like, yeah, it's there. There are people who really think this and talk about it. And for me, I was really fascinated with, man, what would that look like now? Like, how do you do that?
Yes.
And then so for me how do you do that? How do you do that without a white presence? How do you do it in a Latino neighborhood that everyone thinks is black? All these kind of things.
Yes.
And then so it's about the illusion of all this kind of stuff. And part of it is, so there's a character in the book, Foy Cheshire, who's kind of lambasted throughout the book, but there's so much well-intentioned motivation behind his behavior.
He is the character who names the narrator the sellout, right?
Yes, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
sorry I interrupted you.
No, I'm done.
So why does he think the narrator's a sellout?
Yeah, it's because everybody goes, you're a sellout, and then somebody's pointing at me, you're a sellout. No, you're a sellout. It's this kind of, this notion. And I remember Ralph Nader he didn't call Barack an Uncle Tom, but he said if Barack doesn't do X, Y, and Z, this is like 2 weeks into his, first term, then he's an Uncle Tom. And I went, dang, can he do that? It's just, but I think, we throw these terms and don't even realize what we're talking about. And a friend of mine gave me a book that's called I don't know the exact title, but it's something like The Directory of Uncle Toms in America. And so it's like a phone book of Uncle Toms.
This sounds dreadful.
It's a brilliant, funny, unbelievably well-researched book. But there's no one's name is on the book.
Oh.
And so you think of somebody, you go, Colin Powell, and there's an entry of Colin Powell.
Really?
Bill Cosby, and there's an entry. Tiger Woods, there's an entry. Angela Davis, all these people. And I was like, man, everybody's in here, But it was interesting for me to think about, like, who is, when are you not? And it's, and it goes back to that identity thing. It goes back to Cross having the gall to go, this is what a black person is. You know, this is how you get here. And we were talking about earlier that I did this Australia conversation.
Yes.
And the guy said, so how long have you been black? I can't remember what he said. Something, or he said, how did I become black?
It was a disastrous interview that instantly went viral across the internet.
No.
We will not be repeating it here.
But it's disastrous depending on my mood, depending on how one asks the question. You know, there's so much there. So it's not the question. There's a bunch of stuff. Because that's what Cross is talking about. He's going, well, how do you come black? But there was other things that had gone on beforehand that made that question different. Because he was really asking something else. And I don't know what I'm tired, I'm rambling.
You replied
sorry.
to him, when did you become white?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't want to do the notion of there's a guy who's I'm not going to tell the story. There's the notion of what's public conversation and what's private conversation.
Yes.
I never understand that. You know, that doesn't really make much sense to me. Got something to say? You say it. You know, this notion of audience, who you write for, all that kind of stuff, those aren't things that I think about very much, you know. So when I have these kind of inner dialogues with myself about blackness, about Los Angeles, about my relationship to fruit and vegetables, you know, all this kind of stuff, it's like, yeah, I don't know how to, it's how do you become me is kind of the fundamental question. And it's a question that gets asked in the book, you know, under the notion of this kind of individual and then by extension, like a communal kind of therapeutic action, you know?
Yes.
And we constantly don't ask ourselves this. And I think this, I'm tired today, but I think one of the things that I get, it's one of the things you did the NBCC thing that we were talking about. And then so one of the things that I've always enjoyed about that award is oftentimes they're given to books that aren't affirming to how the nation thinks of itself, how we think of ourselves as readers. And that makes people uncomfortable.
Yes. Yes.
You know, but oftentimes I think those are the books that stay relevant in a way. Maybe not read, but there's something there that those books don't go anywhere for a long time, hopefully. Go ahead.
You describe America in one great line as the country that's always looking in the mirror, preening, and not looking at itself.
Yeah.
It's a brilliant paradox, which brings me to poetry. You started as a poet.
Yeah,
You published 2 books of poetry.
I did.
You don't publish poetry anymore.
No, not at all.
Why did you drift away from
You
poetry?
have to do a lot of talking as a poet.
You didn't like performing?
Yeah, I don't like reading. So no.
How does poetry continue to affect the way you write fiction?
It does, because it's not like I know how to do this, but it's where I first thought about how do I, you know, meld all these different languages in my head, all these different tonalities that are in my head into one sentence.
Yes, you can see that throughout the book. This is the poet writing, because of the kind of compression, the multiple things you're trying to do in every line, like a poet.
Yeah, and part of it is you're kind of trying to, it's a psych phrase of being in the here and now that gets tossed around a lot. And that always really rings true for me, because even in that phrase, you know, there's multiple histories in there. I mean, so much word comes with so much weight, so much baggage, you know. I don't know, there's a writer who's, anybody know Christopher Isherwood? He wrote a beautiful book called The Single Man.
Yeah.
He's got a passage in there where he's...
That's the boat.
Oh,
there.
sorry, I thought it was like feedback. He's got a passage in there where he's teaching this class, and he's telling the students about the here and now, and about how that means forever, because it's the past, it's all that stuff that's happening in that moment. It's not just about that moment, you know? And that's something that's really stayed with me, you know? And so I kind of try to write with an awareness of that, because I know it's just not about the present, you know? I don't know. I'm not very good at putting it into words.
You think of the Supreme Court outlawing segregation in 1954, and that was pretty much the last time schools were segregated in America.
Yeah.
Which I mean that absurdly, of course. Most of our kids still go to schools that are highly segregated, right? Even though it's been illegal for decades now. So when your narrator tries to resegregate the schools, it's a little act of absurdity because the schools are already segregated.
Yeah, but there's also another historical thing. So one of the things people don't know about the, Brown versus Board of Education, some of the precedents why they won that were based on the segregation of Mexican Americans in the Southwest educational system. All that kind of stuff. But that never gets talked about in the history. So that's not exactly why the school in there is basically 90% Latino, but it's about these things, how do we think about this? And I have some stuff in the book, based on stories that my mom's friend told me, about growing up in Arizona in the 40s and the 50s, and that kind of segregation. We used to sit in a church, all the whites sat on this side, and all the Latinos sat on this side, and I was like, why? Because as the sun came up, this side got really hot. All these little things. We buried her father there in a segregated cemetery. There's just all this stuff, but it just doesn't often get talked about in the same thing. It's always this was happening, and that's all the case. But for me, it's I'm kind of just regurgitating not how I learned this stuff, but how I came to think about these issues, and these are people who I love, who I've grown up, who've helped raise me, There's a part in the book, one of my favorite chapters, which is Too Many Mexicans, and that comes from a real conversation that I had with my friend Billy. And we're standing on his porch, and he went, man, there's too many Mexicans. And Billy's Mexican-American, So it's
It's a shocking passage. Yeah. You use humor throughout the book to make us laugh at things that we feel ashamed about or that shock us.
Yeah.
It's so funny, it's easy to forget how tragic the book is. It's about a boy who loses his father in a gruesome, horrible shooting. His father was abusive. His town is wiped out. I mean, all these things are not funny when you describe them. But when you read them in the book, you find yourself constantly being amused, being asked to laugh. In The White Boy Shuffle, your first novel, the narrator says, I was the funny, cool black guy. How do you know when something is funny?
Man, there's no law.
Is it funny to you?
Yeah, I mean, there
Are we laughing at things you don't think are funny?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I do that all the time. I'm inappropriate laughter all the time. So... there's no, this is not, I mean, I just write. It's not like I try to be funny. It's just how I write. So
You must revise.
Absolutely. I mean, it took me 5 years to write
Right.
that book.
So presumably you're doing something, shaping, perfecting, moving things.
Absolutely. But it's all about the language, the thing. It's not about necessarily how to make the joke
You're not
funny.
practicing laugh lines on it.
No, not at all.
Toward the end, there's a comedian you describe who did more than tell jokes. He plucked out your self-conscious and beat you silly with it, not until you were unrecognizable, but until you were recognizable. That's what your book does.
Yeah, I think oftentimes good art does that, I teach, you mentioned earlier, I try to talk to the students, and we talk about craft and all that stuff. But sometimes there's the sense of what you're trying to do.
Yes.
And I tell them to think about those moments when they were thunderstruck. What happened? How'd you feel? Oh, my hair. And I was like, man, I didn't know you could, I get them to just talk about this stuff aloud. And I go, that's what you want to do when you're writing.
Oh, that's hard.
It's absolutely hard. It's absolutely hard. But that's what makes things worth it, And sometimes you don't realize you were thunderstruck till 10 years afterwards, and you go, man, I was in my, I had all this kind of stuff, and I ignored what I was really going on. Or you're making it up. It doesn't really matter. But that's important, and that's what I try to do. I try to really, it's hard. It's, like you're talking, it's not about the joke necessarily, but it's about how do I just keep these goosebumps? If I can put them on my arm, hopefully they'll be on the person reading it.
Right. You published an anthology called Hook'em?
Hook'em, yeah.
Hook'em, an anthology of African-American humor.
Yeah.
Which was controversial right from the cover.
Yeah. It was a great cover, but it was a bad choice.
We'll skip that controversy, but how did you make decisions about what's funny and what's not? How did you know what went in and what didn't? Because as you're an anthologist, that's what you do. You select and you exclude.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think I put that book together because there's a book called Oreo by a woman named Fran Ross that is so good, so funny, and so original.
Yes.
And it had been out of print for 30 years or something. Come into print and then quickly went back out of print. And I was like, and I didn't find that book until I must have been in my mid-30s maybe even a little bit later. And I was like, this is a shame because it just doesn't fit into the category about what a black woman is supposed to be writing about and how she's supposed to be writing. And it's an ingenious book, just about this woman going to look for her father in Philadelphia.
It's a novel.
I mean, he's in New York, she's in Philly. Yeah, it's a novel. And then it got me to think about, like, well, what kind of literature, how did I come to, whatever literature I've come, like, how did I miss this? And it got me to think about, so my mom had, like, a fantastic library, and we never had a television, so me and my sisters just read. And I never thought about it. But I had never read a black book or a book written by a black author, except for one nonfiction book, now I think about it, until the school that I went to sent me a copy of Why the Caged Bird Sings in the mail.
Maya Angelou.
Maya Angelou. And I remember I tried to read the book, I just hated it.
Why? It's a classic. It's thought all over.
Yeah, absolutely. But I was like, why are they sending me this book? It's this. I wasn't sure what that thing was.
Yes.
But there was something in there that was wrong. But then when I think about when I did, on the rare occasions that I did get African American literature, it was all on that same dour, very sober note.
Yes.
And I was like, yeah, it can't all be like this. Me and my friends, same thing that we're doing. We talk about this all the time, but we crack jokes, we cry, we laugh, we're confused. It was just, there was something, and I think this is not just true with African American literature. I mean, I think this is a bigger issue. I don't know what I'm saying here.
You told The Guardian that students see a very slender sliver of African American literature. It's all earnest.
I think they see a very sliver section of literature in general, and it is all earnest for the most part. You were talking about this satire class. I gave them all these books, G.K. Chesterton, I gave them Oreo, Philip Roth, all this stuff that for me was important at some level. And they were just shocked. They were like, wait, you can do this? And
what seemed transgressive to them about it?
That's a good question. So I think, not all of them, but many of them feel very limited by what they can say and how they can say it. And I understand that, and I don't think that there's anything wrong with feeling limited. Then there's being limited is another thing. So the story I tell is I had a class, and the first class of the semester, this was a writer's workshop, was a story that fundamentally was about this black guy raping a white woman. And I remember reading the story and I went, oh, geez, this is going to be a long class tomorrow. And so we get into class, and the students, I don't remember the makeup of the class act, but he's sitting at the end of the table, and they're just, you can't do this, you can't, you're not allowed, you can't, on and on. So I let him go for like 5 minutes. And I said, can someone write a story about a black guy raping a white woman? And they went, yes. Then I pointed at him, white guy. I said, can he write a story about a black guy raping a white woman? And it's not like I want more stories about black men raping white women. But and then I said, can he do it? And they went, yes. And I went, okay, now talk to him. And then their discussion got so nuanced, so smart, because they started really talking about what was in the story that made them feel a certain way.
Not the author, not the identity of the author.
Right. And it was about, this is predictability, this is, all this kind of stuff. And it was just mostly about just how one-dimensional it was being talked about, which is a problem with writing. It's a problem with creating. That's, it's called a character, It's not called well-rounded. But it's an issue. It's a thing that we struggle with, And so we think about ways to, how do you counterbalance that? Do you want to counterbalance that? What are you trying to do? So after the class, I spoke to the kid. He's a fantastic writer. And I spoke to him, and I was like, in a weird way, you've done yourself a favor. And to his credit, he took it very well. Like, he wasn't defensive about anything. And I said, you kind of stepped on every landmine you could step on your first time out.
In school.
And I think, and it's like, I'm not trying to tell you what to say, how to say it. I'm trying to tell you, be considerate. Put your foot down. Step on the landmine if you want to. But be considerate. What happens? That blows up. The person next to you also can't. Just be considerate. It's not about you can't do or you can't let anyone tell you that.
Right.
I was going to say something else, but I forgot.
But if you do it, you better do it really well.
Yeah, you got to do anything well, and my well is not going to necessarily be his well, but I'm just asking him to be considerate. That's all.
Toward the end of the book, there's a very painful scene where there's a comedian in a black club. He's doing great, telling great jokes, and a white couple comes in.
Yeah.
And they're at the sit down, and they start enjoying the routine, and they're laughing, and the comedian stops. Says, "What are you laughing at?
Yeah.
You can't laugh at these jokes. Get out." And the white couple sheepishly leaves.
Yeah.
Now you say something.
No, what are you asking me? just ask me. You have to say what you really want to say. It's like.
So.
I think like that hesitation sometimes is the problem.
So here I am, a white guy, reading this hilarious black book, and I'm laughing, and then at the end I'm told, "Get out."
But we have to talk about this a little bit.
So I sheepishly put the book down and leave.
We have to talk about this a little bit. And I think it's that reading this thing of, okay, you tell me what I'm supposed to think.
Yes.
That's a problem. That's a problem. The other problem is going, hey, I'm a white guy. Hide behind the wall.
Yeah.
You can't do that. And I don't mean like as a white person. I mean just as people, we can't do that. Because, so this won the Man Booker Award.
Yes.
So Man Group is this big investment firm, and they've asked me to talk to their employees and stuff. So I was talking to a woman, and she was like, yeah, as a white person, I didn't know how to get into the book, this and that. And I talked to a colleague, and he went, well, start with the book might be funny. And then, oh, yeah, that opened up. And I went, well, it had nothing to do with you being a white person, because I was like, what color was the person who told you that? And she went, oh, he was white. And I was like, there's so much more. You got to start asking yourself. It might be related to how you perceive your whiteness or whatever. But it's much more than just being white, just being this, just being that. But we just automatically go to these kind of things, but they're walls in the way that we talk about this. Instead of going, hey, what is it about me? Me. That's giving me pause, giving me this. Because it's easy to go, oh, I'm white, I don't get it. Or I'm a guy, I don't get it. I'm this, and I've never read like that. Thank goodness. Because I read stuff that I should hate, but there's something about it that's appealing. And I think we don't talk about these kind of, again, laughing when you're not supposed to, liking something you're not supposed to like. But we try to paint these rules. And I'm sorry.
Social media has not helped this cause.
I don't know. Why hasn't it?
The kind of violence elicited on social media quiets people quickly.
Yeah.
Sensitive people.
Yeah.
And the voices that are left are all shrill.
And I think that kind of violence, I'm using that word violence
Yeah,
very loosely.
I am too.
But I think that happens in everyday life. That kind of violence happened to me in school. On the drive up here, I was like, oh, it's a Supreme Court theme, this and that. And I thought about taking this constitutional law class in college. And I remember the first day of class, the professor said, well, we're not doing the 13th and 14th Amendment. We're skipping that. And I went, what the fuck?
You're just doing the important ones?
But yeah, basically. He had this whole thing, but the violence, again, very loosely, was that I checked out. Like, I just checked out. I didn't maybe know it at the time, but I was like, man. And those kind of things happen all the time, Social media, good, bad, I don't know. I don't really know. I don't read comments very much. I guess now and then. But, you get all this vitriol,
Yes.
much of it unbelievably misogynist, unbelievably whatever, put any word you want on it. But then there's always that really well-written, very thought-out counter to a bunch of that stuff. And I'm like, there's some woman somewhere in some basement who somebody's paying her to just respond to all this stuff in a measured, really smart way. But there's always that one thing.
We have to find that woman.
Yeah, and the other thing, like for social media, is one of the so simple is I was like, oh man, there's some funny people out there.
Yeah.
It's just like there's some really funny people out there.
When you're charged with making up an anthology of Black American humor, you have to get some idea of what Black American humor is, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, for me, yeah. And so for me, it's my sense of humor. So I've got Sojourner Truth, because I think that famous speech of hers is really funny. But no one ever talks about how funny that is.
No, it was a complete revelation. Many of your choices were revelations.
And so it's the thing about how do you read, when do you stop and pause and go, oh, you know what, that's actually kind of funny.
Yes. Read this poem in Joker, Joker, Deuce?
You want me to read this? All right. Everybody's here is like at least as old as me, so people might get it, actually. So it's called Why That Abbott and Costello Vaudeville Mess Never Worked with Black People. Who's on first? I don't know, your mama.
You once wrote, everyone is so insecure, we're afraid to laugh at ourselves and for anyone to laugh at us. There's a great discussion of being offended in Sellout.
Yeah.
Someone said, what does that mean? When me asks, I'm offended. What does that mean?
Yeah.
Does anything offend you?
Well, let's start with the first part of that first, with, laughing at yourself. I mean, the book is fundamentally, I'm mocking myself. And you were talking about poetry. In a poem, I wrote a poem when I was young, somebody would, sorry about that.
I think it'll just plug back in.
Okay. When I was young, as what always happens, people beat you up, people mock you, whatever. And our phrase was like, oh, stall me out, man, stall me out, Ease up, leave me alone. And so I wrote a poem called Stall Me Out. And it was just me taking these vicious hacks at myself. It's sort of funny. But when I wrote that, something clicked. And it just really freed me up. Because it was stuff that people had said about me, just, things that Fred, but it really freed me up. I can just say anything I want about myself. And if I start there, that allows me to hopefully say some other things. Because I had a student use this phrase, skin in the game, and it's still about me. I'm still punching, myself a little bit, punching things that I care deeply about.
Yes.
And I think, because people say, well, how do you get away with this and all this, I was like, I don't know if I'm getting away with anything. But it's because I'm kind of shooting the arrows at myself is what I'm trying to do.
Does anything offend you? Is that a phrase you use?
Yeah, it's not a word that I use very often, But yeah, I think people perfectly have a right to be offended. I think I get offended when somebody goes, you don't have a right to be offended, Then I'm offended, because that's like a problem, To go, I get to say anything you want, but you don't get to be offended by it. I was like, that's a problem. So, yeah, it's not a word that I use, or like you can do anything. I don't even know how to answer that question. So
it's the same response in the book, pretty much.
Yeah, you've got me going back in my head when I think about these things. I remember being a freshman at school, and there was a guy there. He was like a resident assistant, big black guy, and for Halloween he dressed up as a Klansman. This is 1980. And like the same, for some people, a couple people laughed and this and that, and he had his rationalization about it, But him doing that always really struck me. What's going on in his head that he thinks that's funny?
Yeah.
Is it funny? All this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And Chappelle did a very similar thing, but he has another context on it, But yeah, I don't have like an answer, like I feel a certain way about this necessarily, but it was an act for me that I was like, oh, I know you could do that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Questions? Yes. Thanks so much for talking with me.
Thanks,
Would you
Ron.
take questions from the audience?
Yes.
Okay. We have time for questions. There's a mic on either side here. Please come up and ask whatever you'd like. And thank you so much. It's great to talk to you.
Thank you, guys. Thanks.
Really, such an honor for me. Yes, sir.
I thought your portrayal of Los Angeles, everything about it was brilliant, having spent a little time there and not thinking much of it. But what caused you to pick Los Angeles as where this was to happen?
Yeah, I mean, that's where I grew up, is Los Angeles. It's not a place I go back to physically very often, but I go back in my head all the time. I have a weird kind of nostalgia, romanticism. The place has changed and not changed. And I think all my books are about being lost at some place, but it's a place where I know how to be lost, you know? And so much of my writing is memory in a weird way, false, fake, things I want my memories to be, basically, you know? But LA is just where I just can figure out how to render that, you know, and I just kind of know, I know where the characters' feet are there.
Well, as I said, it was brilliant.
Thank you so much.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi. So your book is the best book I've read in years.
Oh, thank you.
And I just wanted to hear a little bit more from you on two things that I noticed. And one is the narrator talks a lot about being afraid, being scared, uncomfortable, and kind of where that came from. And then, like, the dumb donut intellectuals. I just need to hear a little bit about where that came from. Thanks.
The first one I can answer, the second one probably not, but that's me again. You know, I'm afraid of everything, and I'm always uncomfortable. It's a problem, but it's that's, you know, but it's, you know, I've become increasingly aware of it, you know. Again, like I don't, you know, I'm reflective in weird ways, but it's like a woman saying to me, "Why are you afraid of everything?" You know, I flinch if somebody tries to touch me, so it's, you know, but I'm making it work for me.
And the dum-dums, where did they come?
Yeah, I just Heritage Foundation. I mean, any think tank is always the phrase think tank just cracks me up. So yeah, it's a good phrase, but it just cracks me up. Yeah, I'm getting Meet the Press on my mind, and anytime they drag these people out, you know, sometimes they have good things to say, but there's a notion of who's paying for these jokers, you know. But, you know, and also that notion of hectoring and of lecturing and of all these kind of things, you know, and of sloganeering and all this kind of stuff. And then back to LA, donuts are a huge part of LA, I guess. You know, if you know that. The donut shop is an important spot. And there's a franchise called Yum Yum Donuts, actually, now that I think about it. Yeah, that I never go to, but yeah.
There were several discussions earlier in the week about your book, and someone brought up the underlying sadness in the Sellout.
Yeah.
Could you talk about that?
Where was I? I think it was in London. A woman stood up. She was, I think, a psychology student. And she was like, you know, one of the things that no one talks about is how the father is kind of like the therapist to this entire community that are all feeling traumatized for whatever reasons. I don't know. I have this weird notion in my mind that I don't know if it's true, but I think a lot of good things are sad, funny. You know, these things all happen at the same time. It's not like something like I'm setting out to write a sad book, you know, or I'm setting out to write a funny book. But yeah, in addition to being fearful, I'm a very depressed person also. So, you know, yeah, it's just. This is, God, you guys, I don't know, I got to start sleeping because I start rambling when I don't sleep. But I remember a woman that I had met, and she was always smiling, and it made me really uncomfortable. And I did the complete asshole thing of like, why are you always smiling? No one's this happy all the time. But she talked about why she felt the need to do that, you know? And I was like, I try not to, you know, it's not like I'm a lazy person, but I try not to extend myself in certain points. Like, so I try not to smile. I don't dress up. I have this weird, again, LA notion of being casual somehow, or faking some kind of comfort level. And yeah, I'm not answering your question. Like, I don't know how to exactly talk about sadness, but
It's okay.
yeah, it's. I mean, I think
She's comforting you.
I would just like to say one thing to you about the Dum Dum Club.
Sure.
It was really nice to see that a group of men, that they were a group. That there was a group of men that got together on a regular basis. I thought that was kind of refreshing. In
Okay,
its own
thank
little
you.
way.
Thanks.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So the comic energy of your book is the most positive thing I've read in years.
Yeah, thank you.
And I wondered when you said you wakened up to what you could do in your experiences. As I read your book, I could not get Ralph Ellison's scene with the fight at the beginning of the book out of my mind.
Yeah.
And I wondered, was that the sort of thing, was his Invisible Man a way of opening up what you could do in a comic way?
Like directly, no. I mean, it's a beautiful book. I love that book. But I think, and this gets to the sadness thing also. So growing up, I used to listen to a ton of Richard Pryor. And it's so funny, it's so sad. And then I compare every comedian to Richard Pryor or whatever, And I go, what is it that he's doing that just held me, And it's the vulnerability, And whether it's the comedy, I don't want to talk about it like it's intentional. My intention is just to try to tell a story, But that's the thing, that's the gripping thing. And maybe at some level that's why it's funny, I don't really know. But there was just something so powerful in that. And also like how, for me it's like I think about all these kind of unfettered texts that for me really worked. Sebald's writing, Pryor, Margaret Atwood. She talks about urgency. I don't know, these things are just things that I feel. It's not like I write these down and sit down and write the book, But these are just things that really, about how I process day-to-day life, how I see things. I can't really answer it, any better than that. And just stuff that I love, Catch-22. I remember being like 13 reading Catch-22. And I read it because I was like a World War II groupie. I was just like, I was like a Nazi back, It was nuts. But that just opened up all these other avenues for me, I think about, like, there's a graphic novel called Mouse, Art Spiegelman. Anybody know this kind of stuff? Which is about the Holocaust and all this kind of stuff. But it's really funny. It's really sad. Like, I think about all these things at once. Again, how do you write the sentence? Because I'm experiencing all these things at once somehow, And so there's something of, it's not like I'm trying to emulate that, but it's just something that speaks to me somehow, Ernst Lubitsch, To Be or Not to Be. These movies that are about these horrific things. And there's something, again, we're talking about like when's the right time and all this kind of stuff. Lubitsch does this beautiful movie about Poland, anticipating the Holocaust, all this kind of stuff. But when the movie comes out, no one can deal with it. But now, there's something in there that's so timeless, But we're not always ready for it, So, yeah. Thank you.
Last question.
My comment is that your prose is just gorgeous and on fire. My question is, in case you haven't noticed, we're mostly old white people. After you get some sleep and you're going back home, I'm wondering what you would hope that we get from you, from your words, from your book. If you, at any point you'll think, God, I hope those people think about anything?
I don't have the audience thing, Marlon James, who won before me, was like, oh, you got to write your book for white women or else no one's going to buy it. All right. I know what he's getting at when he says that, but I don't have the time, It's like, so, I think about all these books that I love, that they could give a fuck about me. some of these books are hateful. Like, I love Heart of Darkness. It's one of the most racist kind of books you can ever read. But there's something about that book because he's being honest, and that's, for me, there's something there. And I'm not saying that, that needs to be replicated or duplicated. But he's not thinking about me. He's trying to tell the story. My sister's a playwright, and she said something to me that really stayed with me. She said, people are much smarter than we give them credit for. Because obviously the normal thing is, everyone's dumb, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, And at the time, I'd gone through this thing for like 20 years where I was reading every oral history that I could get my hands on. And one of the things I think about Studs Terkel's Working, and one of the things about that book that was so important to me is, man, everybody is so smart. You just got to ask them the right thing. And then their insight, their depth, it's just unbelievable, the stories that people can tell. And then so for me, it's about that trust. So, the Little Rascals are a huge part of this book. And I remember going, no one knows who the goddamn Little Rascals are.
They do.
Here we do, right? Yeah. So, but like, that was a thing for me.
These are your people.
Yeah. So, exactly. But it's not like it's the Little Rascals. It's how do you render it? What do you bring into it? What's being illustrated? So you asked me that, and it's, again, I go back to that Nabokov thing, because they kind of ask him that, not based around race, but he's like, I'm not a person who's going to say I'm writing this book to change your mind, to change your thinking. I'm writing the book to just give you the little, Nabokov talks about this little tingle at the base of your spine, and you do with it what you will, Just, but like, these are real questions, because these questions come up in how do I sell a book, and all this kind of stuff. And I've gotten, I don't know about better, but I've gotten freer, because I'm not worried. I'm worried about my space, not your space. And then those may intersect. They may not. I can't. I don't worry about it. So I've got these little keys that people have given me that I've taken away from life that allow me to write. But again, it's about trusting the reader, and then trusting what I'm doing. And then hopefully someone will get it. Yeah. No, thank you.